Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we currently have 2 applications out for the King's Indian on iPhone and on Android. Check them out. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at an unexpectedly interesting variation of the French defense known as the French exchange. The French defense opens with the moves pawn to e4, and now pawn to e6. And with the move pawn to e6, black is preparing to stake a claim in the center with the move pawn from d7 to d5. And this is exactly what happens after the most common moves, pawn to d4, and now pawn to d5. Now, generally speaking, black's idea in the French defense is to eventually or immediately lure white into bringing the e-pawn up to the e5 square, and then after the center is fixed in this way, black hopes to begin to undermine the center with the move pawn to c5 and also at times pawn to f6 before white has a chance to consolidate the center and build attacking chances. For example, after the move pawn to d5, white sometimes plays pawn to e5 and then black immediately plays pawn to c5. Or, more commonly, white often plays knight to c3 or knight to d2, and then black again aims to provoke the move e4 to e5, often with the move knight to f6, or in the case of knight to c3, black can also try the move bishop to b4, and both of these moves are directed at forcing white to play e5, whereupon black continues with pawn to c5. However, in today's video, we're going to take a look at a completely different approach for white based on capturing the pawn on the d5 square, and then black recaptures on d5, and we reach a symmetrical position known as the French exchange. Now, with the French exchange, white has given up his space advantage, his attempt at a space advantage, and he's also unleashed the light squared bishop on c8 here for black, and so white's chances of a theoretical advantage are somewhat smaller. However, white has managed to avoid some of the theoretical lines associated with advancing the pawn to the e5 square, and at the same time, he's initiated a sort of more psychological struggle where white will attempt to find a way to place his pieces in better situations and to outplay his opponent over time. Also, since the position is symmetrical, white hopes to have frustrated black's attempts at a counter-aggressive game, and instead, white is playing in a way which makes it a little bit more difficult for black to find winning chances. Therefore, throughout this video, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that black has found to keep winning chances in the French exchange, and we're also going to look at various setups for white. Let's take a look. The French exchange begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and now the move pawn takes pawn on d5, and pawn takes pawn on d5. Now from this position, there's going to be 3 key moves that we look at throughout this initial video here. To begin with, let's look at the reasonable move, bishop to d3. With this move, white gets on with his kingside development, and at the same time, he leaves his options open for where to develop his king's knight. For example, the knight now does not need to simply go to f3, but the knight may also choose to go to e2 in this position, and this can come in handy for a couple of reasons. In the first place, if white chooses e2 instead of f3, he doesn't have to worry so much about the bishop to g4 pin, which is possible after the move knight to f3, and also in certain cases the knight on e2 may help white to play the move bishop to f4 after a bishop appears on d6 for black, allowing white to exchange off his semi-bad bishop for black's good bishop. But for now, all we know is that white is playing the move bishop to d3. Now from here, there are quite a few ways for black to continue. One of the most common ways to continue is simply with the move bishop to d6. However, if you take a look at grandmaster practice, you'll find that there's another move which is more popular for black here. And that move is to simply play knight to c6, attacking the d4 pawn, which is now unprotected thanks to white's move bishop to d3. And almost invariably, white continues with the move pawn to c3 in response to this move knight to c6 as a method of defending the d4 pawn. Again, if white tries the move knight to f3, black has access to the pin bishop to g4. And it's not quite known yet whether white wants to play the knight to f3 or to e2, so most commonly white continues with the move pawn to c3, and only now does black play the move bishop to d6. Now, by introducing the move knight to c6, black has already managed to bring about some asymmetry into the position. In other words, the position is no longer symmetrical. Black's knight has played itself to the c6 square, whereas the counterpart square on c3 is occupied by a pawn for white. As a result, black is a little bit ahead in piece development, and at the same time, black has faster chances of being able to castle on the queen side as opposed to the king side, and this is another way which black can create imbalances in the position. A perfect illustrative line which shows this idea of castling on opposite sides occurs after knight to f3. Black can now play bishop to g4, castles king side, knight g to e7, simply developing the knight, rook to e1, queen to d7, this has all been played before, knight b to d2, and now castles queenside. And this position has been reached both at the club level and also at grandmaster level. Here, black has already connected his rooks because he's managed to bring all of his queenside pieces out and also to move his queen. Whereas, by comparison, white is still 2 moves away at least, actually at least 3 moves away from being able to connect his rooks. And this translates into a slight advantage for black in the sense that he can often use this as a way to challenge the e-file, perhaps with knight g6 and rook h to e8. In fact, this is exactly what happens after pawn to b4, which is most commonly played here. Black now plays the move knight to g6, and this has a couple of ideas in mind. One idea is that the knight may sink itself into the f4 square or into the h4 square. At the same time, black is able to profit from the fact that his rooks are already connected, since now he's threatening to play the move rook h to e8, taking over the e-file. Finally, the move knight to g6 also vacates the e7 square, so that if white continues with pawn to b5, black now has access to the move knight c to e7, a very comfortable location for the knight. This position, after pawn to b4, knight to g6, which is one of the main lines here, is definitely quite nice for black, and we have no problem saying that black has managed to create adequate counter chances in the French exchange if this is the way things play out. Now, another option for white in this position is to avoid playing the move knight to f3, which allowed black to carry out the move bishop to g4. Instead, white has also tried the move knight to e2 in this position. Again, based on the idea that bishop to g4 can now be met with pawn to f3, and so it's not quite as good here. After knight to e2, as we pointed out before, white is also preparing the move bishop to f4. So, for example, after knight g to e7, which has been played in several games, castles kingside, castle's king side, white can now look for the move bishop to f4. And the general idea here is that after the dark squared bishops are exchanged, white's light squared bishop is just a little bit better than black's light squared bishop because black has his central pawn fixed on the d5 square. This means that as the game wears along, white is going to be more likely to find good locations for his bishop or even some sort of ways to create pressure, whereas black's bishop is always going to find some problems even out into the endgame. This kind of very subtle strategic advantage is the kind of thing that white is looking for when he plays the French exchange. He's not looking to accomplish a whole lot in these positions, but he's hoping to gradually, by and by, outplay the opponent in this kind of way. However, there's some good news for black in this position as well. After the move knight to e2, black has access to a couple very counter-aggressive moves here which throw a wrench in white's plan. One idea is to bring the queen all the way out to the h4 square. And with this move, black first of all temporarily prevents white from castling kingside, since the move castles kingside can be met with queen takes h2 checkmate. Therefore, the move queen to h4 temporarily at least prevents white from playing the move castles kingside. At the same time, the queen on h4 protects the f4 square and therefore makes the move bishop to f4 somewhat less likely. In games which reach this position, one of white's most common methods was to play the move g3, which of course creates some weakened light squares around his position, and now black simply played queen to h5 and the game wore on from here. Black can claim a partial success here because now, even if the dark squared bishops are exchanged, the light squared bishop that black remains with is more likely to find some active squares on g4 or h3 as a result of white having weakened the light squares with the move g2 to g3. Therefore, this move queen h4 I rather like, and this is definitely one way which black can keep the position very unedged, and at the same time, black still has chances of castling on the queen side as a result of having moved his queen. Another approach which has often been tried here instead of queen to h4 is simply queen to f6. Again, preventing the move bishop to f4 and making the development of black's pieces, either he can develop the light squared bishop or the knight to e7, making the development of black's pieces quite easy to achieve here. Both of these moves, queen to f6 or queen to h4, maintain a counterbalanced position in which black is by no means inferior. Finally, instead of knight to e2 or knight to f3, another option for white in this position is to play the move queen to f3, with the idea of being able to bring the knight to e2 and never having to worry about bishop to g4 again as the queen protects that square. In this case, black usually continues with bishop to e6 defending the d5 pawn, and then a timely move such as queen d7, knight g to e7, and perhaps castles queenside. Again, there's no reason to suspect that black is at any disadvantage in this position, and there should be plenty of ways for both sides to continue, with both sides having roughly equal chances. In addition to the move knight to c6, another way for black to create a counterbalanced game after the move bishop to d3 is to continue with the move pawn to c5, again initiating a direct challenge to the d4 pawn and forcing white to look at how he's going to respond to this. Most commonly, white continues pawn takes pawn on c5, bishop takes c5, both sides develop their king's knight, and both sides castle kingside. This position is also roughly equal with chances for both sides. The pawn on d5 could potentially become a long-term weakness, and white can play moves such as bishop to g5, he can potentially bring the knight out to c3, and he can look for ways to start to pressure the d5 pawn over time. And this can last even into the endgame. On the other hand, all of black's minor pieces, including his knight, which can come to c6, his bishop, which can come to g4, and the possibility of occupying the e file and c file with rooks, all give black adequate compensation for the weakened pawn on d5 and possibilities of very active play. It may be possible for white to respond to the move pawn to c5 with the move pawn to c3, but usually this is not tried, and probably for a couple of reasons. One point is that the c3 square is no longer available for a knight. On the other hand, black can also look to play the move pawn to c4 at any given moment, perhaps even now, as one method of continuing in this kind of position. Most frequently, black simply got on with his development, and white tended to find it necessary to capture on c5 anyway, leading to similar positions as before. So this wraps up our look at the move bishop to d3, which again is one of the most popular ways for white to continue. This is also an opportune time to discuss the move pawn to c4, which is also a possibility in this position. Now, unlike the situation that we just saw with bishop d3, pawn to c5, at the current moment after pawn to c4, white is not actually threatening to take on d5 in a way that would win a pawn, and black simply continues with knight to f6, getting on with his development here, and these positions tend to turn out quite alright for black. White most frequently continues knight to c3, bishop to e7 is played, or bishop to b4 is also an option here. Knight to f3, getting on with development, castles kingside, bishop to e2, or perhaps bishop to d3. This now becomes an excellent time for black to play pawn takes pawn on c4, bishop takes c4, and now let's say either pawn to c6 or knight b to d7. Black will usually play both of these moves. Let's say pawn to c6, castles kingside, knight b to d7, and now the knight is simply planning to come to b6 and then to d5, where in fact black can also play bishop to g4 first, insert the move bishop to g4, attacking, threatening bishop takes f3, followed by queen takes d4, bishop to e3, and only now knight b to d7. And from here, black now plans to play knight b6 to d5, making use of the weakened d5 square since there are no pawns which can attack it, and also perhaps capturing this bishop on e3. And this well-known position is also quite equal and offering chances for both sides. And this is what would tend to happen if white tries pawn to c4 early on in the French exchange. Finally, another popular move for white in this position is to simply develop the king's knight with the move knight to f3. And after knight to f3, there are a couple of little tricks here which black needs to be aware of. From here, if black tries the move knight to c6, which was effective after bishop to d3, white can now develop the bishop not to the d3 square, but to the b5 square, and this has a certain point in mind. Now after the move bishop to d6, which again has been the most common move here even after bishop to d3, white can now play the move pawn to c4, beginning to set up the threat of pawn to d5 if black were to take on c4. After pawn to c4, black most often continues with pawn takes pawn on c4, pawn to d5, pawn to a6, bishop to a4, pawn to b5, and now after d takes c6, b takes a4, we reach a very strange position in which black's queenside pawn structure is quite goofy and messed up in this position, and yet black is temporarily ahead a pawn, and perhaps he has some active play thanks to the fact that he's developed a little bit more quickly. But in practice, this position has not actually turned out so well for black. And of course, leaving the pawn on the c4 square also turns out to be quite a bit problematic for black, since, for example, if black were to try to play the move knight to f6, white could then play the move pawn to c5, and after bishop to e7, and then perhaps either knight to e5 or castles kingside. In both cases, white is doing pretty well in this position, as he's already established a space advantage and has access to a key square on e5. He may even play bishop takes c6 in such a position. Therefore, this little motif of bishop to b5 instead of bishop to d3 is an important point which makes the move knight to c6 far less attractive. Instead, if black were to try bishop to g4, this is another way that he might try to go about the queenside castling plan here. If black were to try the move bishop to g4, here too, it appears that he runs into some problems related to ideas such as h3, bishop h5, bishop to d3, bishop to d6, queen to e2 check, very key idea here, queen to e7, and now bishop to e3. This has been the idea for white in many of these kinds of positions, where he's already played his knight to f3. The idea is that white is actually planning to meet queenside castling with queenside castling himself. And then he can play for some space advantage on the king side with the move g2 to g4, and the transfer of the struggle can happen on the king side, where both sides will castle queenside, and these positions tend to give white a slight advantage. And for this reason, I consider the move bishop to g4 to be inadvisable in this position. Again, after bishop to g4, white can make use of h3 and then an eventual g4, and at the same time, he can then look to play queen e2, bishop e3, and then look how to transfer his own king onto the queen side in the event of black's queenside castling. Again, a very important point to note. Therefore, after the move knight to f3, it's more common for black to continue either with knight to f6 or with bishop to d6. Black does quite fine if he simply plays symmetrically with knight to f6, bishop to d3, bishop to d6, castles kingside, many games have gone just like this, bishop to g5, bishop to g4, pawn to c3, pawn to c6, knight bd2, knight bd7, queen c2, queen c7. A completely symmetrical position with one open file. Both sides are likely to move rooks to the e file, and both sides are also likely to try to exchange off their bishops. For example, many games go bishop h4, bishop h5, bishop g3, bishop g6 with exchanges. And unsurprisingly, almost all the games which go into this long symmetrical variation end in draws. And this is not necessarily a bad outcome for black, but it's also not very counter-aggressive. This is one option available. Finally though, it turns out there's still one more idea left for black, which allows black to create some kind of successful counter chances against the move knight to f3. The best way for black to go about this is to play the move bishop to d6. And the simple idea of this move, bishop to d6, is to leave the e7 square available for the knight. And this turns out in handy in a couple of different ways. In the first case, one way is that simply after bishop to d3, black can play knight to e7, introducing just a little bit of asymmetry into the position once again. Black's knight is on e7 as opposed to white's knight on f3. And as we've seen in counter cases where white placed his knight on e2, black always has the option of now playing bishop to f5 at an opportune moment. Not too early though. Castles kingside, castle's kingside, rook to e1, and now there are a variety of ways for black to continue, and the position is at least a little bit double-edged since the sides have moved their knights to different locations. But perhaps even more exciting for more ambitious players is that after bishop to d6, bishop to d3, knight to f3, black can now play the setup bishop to g4, followed by knight to c6. Let's say castle's kingside, knight to c6, and after pawn to c3, knight g to e7, we've transposed into a variation which we've seen before with bishop to d3, and from here, black plans to play queen d7, castle's queenside, often knight to g6, and again, we've reached a position with counter chances for black. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this close look at the French exchange and that you've been able to get familiar with some of the ideas for both sides. As it turns out, there are actually quite a number of ways for black to change the game up a little bit and to not simply follow suit by white, even though following suit turns out to be perfectly acceptable. Though the French exchange is popular and avoids some of the theory which is involved in bringing the e-pawn up to the e5 square, it turns out that white is having a difficult time proving that there's anything coming out of this idea. As long as black has in mind some of the key points in this video, I think there should be plenty of opportunities for black to develop some counter chances. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this video. It's really exciting to me that we're able to develop these videos and offer them for free on YouTube as a way to grow chess awareness and as a way for all of us to get involved in some of these very simple but very interesting chess opening techniques. For those players who are interested in looking with me at some of these openings quite a bit further, we've developed quite a few applications for both iPhone and for Android, which are available at the application store by searching for chess openings or by searching for Derek Kelly. Most recently, we've released ones on the Queen's Gambit Decline to Roche variation. We have ones on the Carlsbad variation, which has been very popular, the Bishop e7 variation of the Queen's Gambit Decline, and also 2 tutorials on the King's Indian. We very much appreciate all of the people who have so far supported these apps, and we also hope that if you're interested, you'll take a look at these applications for yourself as well. Thanks again for listening.